Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight on a cold night in Athens. I felt like I was promised warm weather when I came to Greece a little bit, coming from Copenhagen, but it's really wonderful to see you all here. Thank you for coming, and to those online, thank you to Sana and Rasmus for organizing, and thanks in advance to Fotini for her response. Today I want to take you on a journey, not just through ancient Corinth, but into a space that most scholars have overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed. It's a space that on the surface doesn't stand out much. Or rather, it does on the surface, architecturally, very much so. It's probably the most conspicuous vaulted structure still standing in the Forum. But not so much in discussion over the last century about the excavations and archaeological investigations and the larger history of Roman Corinth. Just another set of ruins in a vast archaeological landscape of a Roman city, for most scholars and visitors alike. But the deeper you look, the more you realize the space isn't like the others, it's different, and today I want to tell you why. I want to introduce you to what I believe is, or rather I would say I know quite fairly confidently, is a prison in late antique Corinth. I want to show you how we can reconstruct that story from the ground up through archaeology, excavation records, architecture, and most strikingly, the words of prisoners themselves, scratched into the very floors that they sat upon. I believe these prisoner graffiti get us about as close as we're likely to be able to get to the voices of the incarcerated in antiquity. So today I want to do two things. First, I want to explore some of the key findings. Here we are. These are the Northwest Shops, and this is where they exist in the Forum. I want to introduce you to some of the key findings that I've made in my research, summarizing parts of a recent Achaia article, as well as another forthcoming chapter in an edited volume on the graffiti. That volume is on collaborative authorship. More on that in a second. And second, I want to explore two aspects of my research that I did not yet have a chance to share, but will do so today. Namely, the other prisons in Roman Corinth, what can we say about them, and then how the repurposing of the Northwest Shops into a prison fits into the historical and architectural and urban context of late antique Corinth. But first, a word about how to know a prison when you see one. If you were to ask a Roman archaeologist, or really any ancient historian, where are the prisons? I usually get a sigh, a shrug, or some version of, well, that's a tough one. We know they're there. We also know they're hard to identify. Some have even go so far as to assert that we have no secure architectural evidence. So what makes a prison different than other spaces? What are the diagnostic features that allow us to identify it as such? The truth is, we know that prisons must have existed. For starters, Vitruvius, the Roman architect, tells us outright, every proper Roman forum should have a treasury, a curia, and a prison, each in proportion to the size of the city itself. And yet, when you look through archaeological excavation reports of the 20th and 21st century, you find surprisingly little discussion about them. Now, why is that? The problem is fairly simple. Ancient prisons aren't like modern ones. They're not typically large structures built outside the city center to house hundreds, if not thousands, of inmates for limited term sentences. We do have some evidence of that, but that's not what most prisons probably looked like. Sometimes they were, but usually they were underground strong rooms built beneath or as the very foundation of civic buildings like basilicas, tribunals, or temples. Incarceration was occasionally practiced in temporary, makeshift, repurposed buildings like basements or baths or storage spaces converted into holding cells. And such spaces often didn't leave the kind of lasting monumental traces that temples, prisons, and even basilica did. I put it this way in my article: the lack of securely identified prisons has prevented scholars from creating a reliable typology of the Roman prison. To make an archaeological argument for a secure identification of a prison or site of incarceration, we would need a sign, or perhaps that says "Hic est carcer," Or perhaps the remains of a strong room with stocks and shackles built into the walls or floors, or floors with skeletal remains still incarcerated within them, or a chorus of literary or documentary references to a well-known and still identifiable architectural structure. Additionally, we could make an identification of a prison based on something like prisoner graffiti on the floor of a building saying something like, "Cursed be the person who threw us in this lawless place, get me out of here." But even then, we could make a certain identification only if we could establish that the graffiti were written on in situ floor tiles. The paving slabs were known to preserve a sealed level of flooring. And this latter point is exactly what makes the prison in Corinth so exciting. Here we have precisely that kind of evidence. By understanding this site, we can begin to reconstruct the experiences of those confined within its walls. Who were they? What crimes, if any, had they committed? How long were they there? These are difficult questions to answer, but the evidence we have gives us important clues. Now, the site, the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops. Our story starts in the northeast corner of the Roman Forum in Corinth, where we find a series of buildings constructed in the late 1st or early 2nd century of the Common Era. These buildings, known as the Northwest Shops, were likely some kind of a commercial space at first, positioned right alongside the bustling Forum, but at some point, centuries later, we know that that changed. The key structure in this complex is a large, here's a figure showing the 15 rooms, with the large room in the middle is the one called the Boudroumi. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself by telling you this is where the prisoner graffiti were found. The key structure in question is this large complex, a large vaulted chamber called still today the Boudroumi. Now, Boudroumi isn't a Greek or Latin word. It's actually a Turkish loanword for dungeon. The name stuck because by the time 19th century archaeologists began their work, the local Greek population already referred to this space as a dungeon. Now that in itself is interesting. More on this in a bit. The Boudroumi is surrounded by a series of other slightly smaller chambers, 7 on each side, each roughly the same size, arranged in a row, 15 in total. Now, one of the most critical pieces of evidence that ties this space to incarceration is the existence of a single continuous pavement installed across the entire area of the northwest corner of the Forum in late antiquity. Small finds help us to create a loose timeline, which maps intriguingly onto other known data. Thanks to surprisingly helpful 1901 excavation records, specifically Notebook 11, here by Herbert F. Decoux, and Notebook 10 by Rufus Richardson, it became clear that the floor slabs were not added at different times, but were part of an intentional unified renovation of this area of the city, part of a larger late antique urban remodeling program, which I'll return to later in the talk. This suggests a deliberate, unified redesign of the space in late antiquity. The continuous pavement is significant because it serves for us as a terminus postquem for the renovation into a carceral space of the northwest corner of the Forum. The graffiti inscribed on these floors, as we'll see, was left by prisoners who were physically confined within the walls of the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops, not merely passing through. It's clear that the graffiti were inscribed after the late antique pavement was installed, so the graffiti themselves can serve as a terminus antiquem, as the breaks in the paving slab, the careful observance of the breaks when they were writing the graffiti, and they're being found in an in situ as a stratigraphically sealed unit. Additionally, this space retained its function for some period of time, it would seem, before being converted again into a chapel, likely in devotion to the Virgin Mary sometime in the Middle Byzantine period, a practice we see from other early Byzantine prison-turned-sacred sites around the Mediterranean, such as at Rome or Thessaloniki and elsewhere. I won't have time to talk about this tonight in my talk, but if it comes up in the question and answer, I welcome that. The placement of the graffiti on these paving slabs further reinforces the interpretation of this commercial space renovated and repurposed to serve as a prison. If the inscriptions were found haphazardly around different surfaces, some are not clearly carceral. And so we might assume they were left by anyone, travelers, merchants, passerby, really anyone. But the fact that they were concentrated on a single layer of installed pavement in 3 adjacent rooms in locations where that would have been accessible only to confined individuals, this strongly indicates that they were left by prisoners, even when their contents and depictions are not explicitly carceral. About half the contents of the graffiti are explicitly carceral, as I'll show in a moment. The excavation notebooks of Decoux and Richardson from 1901 provide essential documentation on the nature of this pavement. The records clearly demonstrate the limestone slabs as a single new installment of flooring rather than patchwork. Decoux meticulously recorded the consistency of the slabs, noting that they were laid in a single phase, at a single place as the level of pavement, as he referred to it in the notebooks, and were not disturbed by later modifications. Richardson likewise observed that the floor extended throughout the northwest corner of the forum, including the shops in front and just in front of the Boudroumi, and he notes on one page a Roman medallion found just underneath the level of pavement. And here you can try to read along in the top right corner. Roman relief medallion found about a foot below white pavement by Boudroumi, which shows that the pavement and its level is Byzantine and not Roman. So both Decoux and Richardson then treat this pavement as a stratigraphic seal, meaning that it represented a different chronological marker that capped earlier activity in the area. This is significant because it tells us that whatever the space had been used before previously, that phase was closed off by the installation of this pavement. The pavement was not the only renovation. The opening of the Boudroumi to the forum was walled off around the same time, and a small window was left opening to the forum, created in the late antique wall from the Boudroumi. This is another practice that we see from other prisons of the Roman and late Roman period. And a small passageway between the Boudroumi and the chamber directly to the west, as you can see here. So the Boudroumi and directly to the west, there's a passageway created in this same time period. This also creates a structure similar to other known Roman prisons. Now, the graffiti themselves provide additional clues about the pavement's chronology. The way prisoners inscribed their messages tells us not only about their distress, but also about the condition of the stones on which, when they wrote. So take, for instance, inscription 1 here. This 1 refers to the number that I given them in my catalog, and then of course you have the inventory number as well as the IG number there. As you can see here, the graffito writer carefully followed the clean, followed the clean original edge at the top of the stone, but then used the irregular broken edge at the bottom left. Evidence that the stone had been damaged and reused in the late antique pavement level, and the inscription was added after the break. The content of the graffito, as we'll discuss momentarily, could hardly be clearer that this was made by a prisoner. We have other examples where that the break happens prior to the inscribing of the graffiti in about 5 or 6 other places, which I won't go into for the sake of time tonight. The sequence then is crucial. First, the stones had originally been cut and installed as flooring elsewhere. And then some sort of a destructive event, perhaps an earthquake or dismantling, broke them. And only after were they repurposed as flooring in the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops, where then after prisoners inscribed their messages. Since the paleographic analysis dates the graffiti to the 5th, 6th century, and the main epigrapher who's worked on this, Erkki Schronen, dated a few 4th to 6th century, this means the reuse of the stones must have happened before that time. Now, let's get to the part that really clinches the argument. The prisoner graffiti and what exactly they say. In 1901, during excavations of the Northwest Shops and the Boudroumi, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable set of inscriptions. There were some on the walls where you might expect there to be graffiti, though they're understandably much more poorly preserved today. We see examples of, for instance, a ship or what would appear to be a window. The best preserved graffiti, however, are on the floor slabs. And that's important because it means they weren't added later, as I mentioned. But now, what do these inscriptions say? Well, exactly what you might expect a prisoner to write. One of the most striking prisoner inscriptions from the Corinthian pavement is the one we looked at earlier, inscription 1, and the translation reads, "Lord God, who separated the darkness and made light to rise through the inhabited world, repay, God-bearer, repay, implied punishment of Marinos, the one who threw us in here and made us spend winter here." And then Patronia, and then a cross. This inscription, a direct appeal to divine justice, invokes Genesis 1:4, where God distinguishes light from darkness. The prisoner who carved these words was not simply asking for their release, but calling upon cosmic order to rain down vengeance and free them from their situation. Now, part of this here about winter is a bit of a conjectural reading, and I'm following here other previous epigraphers, but very interesting nonetheless that the writer would seem to complain about the cold of the prison in winter, a complaint we hear again and again from other ancient prison petitions and letters. The choice of wording suggests familiarity with Christian liturgical language as well as the scribal imagery of a Chi-rho and a cross. The placement, as I mentioned, is also significant. It follows this clean edge of the top and responding to the broken edge on the bottom left. The interplay between text and material underscores the prisoner's awareness of their physical constraints and their attempt to impose meaning on the very structure that confined them. More than just a plea, inscription 1 stands as an assertion of agency amid confinement. One of the more emotionally charged inscriptions found in the Corinthian prison is what I call in my catalog inscription 3, which reads, "May the fortune of those who suffer in this lawless place prevail. Lord, do not show mercy to the one who threw us in here." This inscription, carved on the floor of the prison, captures the desperation and resentment of an imprisoned individual or group of people. Unlike some of the other graffiti that seek divine deliverance, this text is both a plea and a curse, an appeal for divine favor on the suffering inmates and demand for justice against their oppressor. Now, this phrase, lawless place, is particularly significant. Regardless of how the governor of Achaia might have seen it at the time, the phrase suggests that the prison was seen as a space outside the bounds of legal and moral order, at least to this prisoner, if not to others as well. The presence of this inscription on the pavement further emphasizes its materiality, refusing to be silenced and ensuring that even if the prisoner was forgotten, their suffering and indignation would remain inscribed for subsequent generations of prisoners, and also apparently for us today. One of the more intriguing inscriptions from the prison pavement is inscription 13 in the catalog, which reads, "Lord Jesus Christ, help your slave Cosmos." Cross, amen, cross. Now, the graffiti is unique not only for its plea, but for its placement. It's inscribed directly onto a paving slab here. And you can see the graffiti itself is actually right there. And when I first saw this in Schronen's IG volume, it was not at all clear to me that this was a very, very, very tiny graffito amidst a very, very, very large game board. It's inscribed directly onto the paving slab that already bore a gaming board, or probably two kinds of gaming boards consisting of 2 rows of 5 boxes there in the middle called 5 lines, and an additional game board with circular markings suggesting a modified version of the Roman game 12 scripta or Achaia. Similar boards are found in Aphrodisias and Ephesus, indicating a common pastime among people across the Roman world. The juxtaposition of the prayer and the game board raises compelling questions. Was this an intentional act, layering devotion over distraction? Did prisoners engage in games to pass the time, carving their prayers in moments of desperation between turns? The presence of game boards also suggests that the incarcerated sought ways to endure their confinement. This fusion of the mundane and the sacred provides a rare glimpse into the psychological landscape of Corinth's prisoners, blending recreation with tactics of resilience. Now, one of the more enigmatic inscriptions from the Corinthian prison complex is inscription 16, found in a chamber just west of the Boudroumi within the Northwest Shops. The inscription is fragmentary, broken on top and left, and largely illegible. However, what sets the graffito apart is the accompanying depiction of a human figure. Celier's Breitenbach suggested that the figure represented a young girl in a dress, possibly a loved one of the prisoners. However, this interpretation is problematic. The assumption that the figure wears a dress reflects, of course, a modern bias imposing contemporary gender norms onto ancient representation. Instead, the figure appears to be a soldier clad in chainmail or protective armor, a much more plausible interpretation given the iconographic parallels of Roman military inscriptions elsewhere. Now, if this is indeed a soldier, what does it signify? Was this a reference to a guard or a fellow inmate who had once served in the military, or perhaps a form of personal identification, an imprisoned soldier making his presence known in the space? We don't know, but at least 2 other prisoner graffiti were made by boulikarii, which are sort of a quasi-soldier. Peter Brown described this to me once over coffee as they're like the late antique heavy of the local administrator. The uncertainty surrounding the drawing reminds us of the fragmentary nature of prison graffiti themselves. While some inscriptions provide clear textual evidence of suffering and faith, others like this leave us with only an image, a silhouette of life confined. Regardless of its precise meaning, inscription 16 reinforces the idea that prisoners sought ways to make their presence known, even in the most confined of circumstances. Now, I want to talk for a second about collaborative writing and how these reflect, how do these graffiti help us think about conceptions of authorship? Graffiti in the prison were not isolated acts of self-expression. Instead, they formed a network of inscriptions that built upon each other. Prisoners responded to earlier inscriptions, repeated phrases, and even corrected misspellings. The process of iterative inscription suggests a communal form of writing, a kind of collective prison authorship shaped by shared suffering and hope. Some inscriptions take on the form of religious petitions, mimicking prayers known from Christian liturgy or scripture. Others interact playfully or critically with prior messages, demonstrating an active and ongoing dialogue within the confined space. By analyzing these layers of inscription, we see the prison is not just a place of detention, but also a space of textual negotiation, resistance, and solidarity. What are the theoretical implications of this for thinking about textuality? The Corinthian prison graffiti challenge traditional notions of authorship. They represent what scholars might call distributed authorship, text produced through cumulative multi-author processes. The prison environment created a communal, literary, if we can call it that, space where anonymity and shared experience mattered more, in many cases, than individual identity. Let me talk about just one particular example. Inscription 2, a fascinating, really collection of graffiti, features, as you can see, a depiction of an ear. More than just an isolated drawing, this graffito sheds light on the collaborative and collective nature of inscription practices and tactics of resistance among prisoners. The ear motif, which appears in other ancient graffiti contexts, has been interpreted as a symbol of overhearing or surveillance, or perhaps a desire for divine attentiveness. But what makes this graffito especially intriguing is how it was integrated into other inscriptions in the pavement. Prisoners often interacted with and added to and modified these, such as we see here. This is A, B, C, and D are different hands written in different orientations to the depiction of the ear. In this graffito, we see at least 3 and probably 4 hands. It is particularly telling that it has no named figures, such as we see in some of the other ones, including at least one of the ones I've mentioned already. But it remains anonymous, suggesting a kind of communal resistance technology. This collaborative process suggests that the writing was not simply a solitary act, but a communal one, shaped by conditions of incarceration, involving within a single space over time, and the need to assert presence in an otherwise restrictive environment. The ear graffito, then, is not just a mark, it's an invitation, an echo and a trace of human connection left behind the very stones that confine these people. And having walked through the space and been in it many times, you get the sense that it would be very hard to be heard out of these very thick walls. And you would need to have sort of bent over on your knees and spoken into this ear. So we kind of can imagine how this might have worked, where someone's like, I really want to be heard, right? And this allows a space to sort of enact that. These inscriptions then blur the lines between public and private. Unlike elite literature meant for external audiences, these messages were written for fellow inmates, creating internal readership within the prison itself that we can explore today through the archaeological remains. And they reveal how writing can function as a coping mechanism, a means of protest, and an assertion of presence in a space designed to erase individual agency. Now I want to pivot to use a famous quote, now for the rest of the story. Those of you who have read my article will probably have not been terribly surprised by what I've said so far. But what is coming next are things that I didn't have time to explore or have occurred to me since then. And I want to use the remainder of the time to explore two questions, both mentioned briefly in a sentence or a footnote in the article, only because I arrived at the question too late in the process to say more, but now I like to do so. So I want to talk about the shifting landscape of incarceration in Roman Corinth. Now, if we follow Vitruvius's observation, which you've probably heard about, I would guess, if you've come to the other lectures, in like every lecture, so I'm not going to go into it today, that prisons were often connected to Roman fora, we might expect a prison to have existed already during the early construction of Corinth's Roman forum. The Northwest Shops, initially built in the 1st century CE, later underwent renovations, and their function likely shift. And we have no evidence to suggest that the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops served as a prison in its first phase. So what events between the late 2nd, at the absolute latest, based on the small finds, and the 4th to 5th century, somewhere around the turn of 4th to 5th, created the need for a new prison? And what circumstances would have led to the widespread reuse of broken paving slabs in this area? Put more directly, can we say anything about other prior prisons in Roman Corinth? Before the prison was established in the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops, the most likely candidate for Corinth's prison was in the cryptoporticus of the Julian Basilica. Paul Schouten has recently argued in his Corinth volume that one of the two vaulted rooms beneath the basilica may have served as the city's carcer or prison or ararium from the late Antonine period until the late 4th century when the Julian Basilica collapsed. Here the Julian Basilica from the far middle right of the form, as you can see there. Initially, this underground structure, here we go. This is what it would look like, and this is the initial phase 1 in a reconstruction. These are both from Paul Schouten's volume. Initially, this underground space had an open layout, but in either the Hadrianic or Antonine period, the aisles were closed off, restricting movement. So what I want to do is to build on, I want to build on Paul Schouten's volume and try to narrow in a bit using other evidence that we have from other carceral facilities to suggest that it was the southern aisle as the best candidate for the city's carcer and not the treasury, ararium. I'll briefly mention 5 reasons related to using the developing typology of the prison project, which you have heard about in other lectures if you've been along for the journey, making comparisons to other carceral facilities, and then one other area that would require further exploration. First, the location of the south aisle directly underneath the tribunal. I have a picture of this in here. I'll have to show you in a second. The fact that one of these is directly underneath the tribunal, the place of trial, maps onto several other known prisons, especially the civic prison here in Roman Quiquil or in Jamila, Algeria. And here we're going to be talking about the room that's right here, directly underneath the basilica, and you'll see these stairs in just a second. There's an entrance to a space that goes right underneath here. So the prison in Quiquil, for instance, draws a strong comparison to the South Aisle. The chambers for holding the accused and the condemned were built underneath, directly underneath, and were quite literally the foundation of the area of trial above in the basilica. Yet another similar structure appears in the Roman colony of Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa, founded in the early 2nd century. Interesting that all of these are happening at the end of the 1st and early 2nd century, around the time when this site in Corinth would have been repurposed as well. I won't go into too much detail on this, as my co-author Mark Letney discussed it. The Curia stood prominently on the forum's southern edge, flanked by 2 tribunals where local magistrates rendered judgment. Beneath the eastern tribunal, excavators uncovered a now familiar pattern: a 2 underground chambered room, an antechamber and a secure inner chamber. The archaeologists confidently identified these chambers as a prison. Quote, "It is certain that that underneath the eastern tribunal is the prison based on the underground Roman Tullianum, and no area in Sarmizegetusa is more suited to this function." Now, I won't go into this, but we do suggest there may have been 2 prisons, or there's at least one other candidate for what could have been a prison during this time. Once again, we see a clear architectural logic at work: justice dispensed above and confinement happening literally below the place of judgment. A physical manifestation of Roman legal authority. The mosaic of the captives in Tapasa also illustrates this logic, with a mosaic of local captive Berbers, literally concepted to be the floor on which the judge walked as they held court. So that's the first reason, is the location. The second is the antechamber at the entrance to the southern aisle. A dozen or so out of our database of prisons had an antechamber separating the entrance from the main cell. Now again, here in Jamila, you can see another example. So here's the main street, and this room here would have been an antechamber, and then we would have had 2 separate chambers. Jamila is an example, but we could also list Kosa, Sarmizegetusa, Lambasis, Simitus, Sufetula, just to name a few. These antechambers likely served as places for prison staff to sit and watch the door, as well as staging of prisoner transport. The antechamber in front of the southern aisle fits this pattern tightly in Corinth. Third is the latrines, and here you can see both the antechamber, that was when they secured this space. They created a sort of antechamber here that you would enter, and then also the presence of a latrine in this antechamber. This strongly suggests the use of the aisle as a prison and not as an aurarium. We find other prisons with latrines attached, but usually only inside of prisons, where the prisoners were designed to detain people to whom it mattered that you provide basic sanitation, like, for instance, the gladiator prison in Carales, in Cagliari, in Sardinia, as you can see here. And these are refuse pits. So there's anchors in the wall that you would slide chains through for holding the prisoners. And then in this one, where you have gladiators, where it matters that there's sanitation and like they need to be able to be healthy enough to keep fighting, so you have the presence of a latrine. You also have the presence of a latrine in the workers' prison in Simitus, which we're going up to that top corner, if you zoom in just a bit, here, that structure in the center of the frame. And this is a reconstruction that we had drawn where there is a person playfully using the latrine in the bottom corner there. A latrine, along with the presence of windows, would point towards a prison, especially over and against the treasury, as it is people, not coins, who need to breathe, as we heard in the first talk of our series. But also, coins do not need to defecate either. So that is how that argument works. Here, however, the latrine outside the prison, do I have an image here? The latrine outside the prison would suggest use by both guards and maybe a lucky few inmates as well. Fourth, as Schouten has noted, the thickening of the walls of the southern aisle to add security during the Antonine or perhaps Hadrianic period. Now, this is a telltale sign of nearly all prisons in our database for obvious reasons. And I can only guess, but I would suspect it may be also why the Boudroumi was selected, as the walls in the Boudroumi are unusually thick. Yet, of course, one can only imagine that thick walls hardly help to disambiguate between sites of a prison or a treasury, which brings me to my next point. Well, I want to say one more thing and then I'll come to that. Fifth, and circumstantially, if the Julian Basilica once housed Corinth's prison, its destruction at the end of the 4th century aligns remarkably with the renovation discussed above and the relocation of incarceration facilities to the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops somewhere around the turn of the 4th to 5th century. The timeline begins to become fairly tight. This transition, coinciding with the reuse of broken paving slabs, signals a broader reorganization of Corinth's urban landscape, one that we are now only beginning to understand. I'll add additionally, we don't really have a good sense of what Roman treasuries looked like. Our prison project took as its mandate to figure out a basic typology of ancient carceral facilities, because the state of the art in the field, as I mentioned earlier, was that we have no secure evidence. So at a most basic point, we tried to say we do, and then to begin to build from that. Now, if that was true of prisons, we perhaps know even less about what treasuries looked like. Though we do have a clear sense that they tended to be not under a tribunal, but underneath a temple, such as in the basement of the Temple of Saturn in Rome. Now, one question for further study emerged while on a call with Paul Scoten and my research team, and that is the presence in the walls of the southern aisle and on the floor of other potential security features. This is something that Paul had said he just wasn't looking for and kind of bounced into his mind. This requires further study, and we're going there tomorrow to look. So. Now, can we say anything else about any other prisons in Corinth? Stephanus of Byzantium was a 6th century grammarian, probably early 6th century, maybe during the reign of Justinian I. And he wrote an alphabetical encyclopedia of geographical toponyms called the Ethnica. One entry on the word kos reads as follows: Kos, cave. The pit in Corinth where thieves and runaway slaves are confined. It is also called koos and koes to those convalescing there. For the earth's cavities and all its dens are called kos. Now, interestingly, this entry would be roughly contemporaneous with the use of the Boudroumi as a prison. Kos is likely meant here probably as a moniker or a nickname of the specific prison in Corinth. So kind of like in the US context referring to Attica or Rikers or Alcatraz. There's no connection to the content of the graffiti with the word kos, as far as I can tell. So this may be just yet another carceral facility, specifically for thieves and runaway slaves where they were detained. But on the other hand, and here I am very much speaking out of my own ignorance and curiosity, I wonder if there's a possible linguistic connection between the Turkish loanword Boudroumi, and the Greek word used by Stephanos, orguma. Others may be able to either confirm or probably deny that possible connection, but I figured if I'm going to test it out, I'm likely to have someone here who can say yes or no. Now, I want to turn to the kind of second new point I want to make, and the final main point of the talk tonight. The renovation of the Northwest Shops into a prison within a larger urban renovation efforts. So I want to expand today on the question of where does the relocation of the prison to the northwest corner of the Forum, how does that relate to larger renovation efforts from late antiquity, let's say 4th to 8th century? Amelia Brown's remarkable book, Corinth in Late Antiquity, shows how up to the early 5th century, Corinth remained a key administrative hub, home to the governor of Achaia, one of the only two proconsular governors in the east. His staff decrees and access to the cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, all signaled the city's continued importance. But this was also, of course, a period of upheaval. In 395 CE, Alaric's Gothic army swept through Greece, occupying Corinth for over a year before being pushed north. Despite this, several inscriptions confirm the governor's presence afterwards, overseeing grain distribution from Corinth's Achaia and issuing decrees from the forum's west side, possibly even the Northwest Shops. Even as political instability grew, the Northwest Shops, West Shops, and South Stoa remained central to the forum's function well into the 5th and 6th centuries, whether as administrative buildings or even repurposed housing. Overall, however, a gradual shift in street use and market habits signaled transformation, especially after the 6th century, as Corinth moved into the Middle Byzantine period. As is well documented, a series of significant earthquakes rocked Corinth in the final decades of the 4th century, ultimately leading to the demise of the Julian Basilica, including its potential prison, in the subterranean southern aisle. And additionally, a series of inscriptions speak to large-scale construction and renovation works done across the forum, including in the northwest corner by the governor of Achaia in 366-67, 393, 395, 402. While half a dozen examples could be listed, a pair of inscriptions is worth our attention here. John Harvey Kent, in Corinth 9.3, linked inscriptions in his volume numbered 504 and 505, the former of which reads, Titus Flavius, don't say something Clanus, the most distinguished governor, erected this structure in the name of security and victory and the unceasing fidelity of our greatest invincible emperors, so on and so forth. Kent points out that this inscription naming Valentinian raises questions about the timeline of the West Shops restoration after the earthquake of 375. It also refers to Valentinian II, if it refers to Valentinian II, the colonnade would have remained in ruins for at least 8 years, which is possible but unlikely, especially since blocked entrances would have rendered the shops unusable. Now, Kent follows and says a more plausible scenario is that the reconstruction began within 2 or 3 years of the disaster, making it more likely that the inscription refers to Valentinian I, dated therefore to 366 or early 367. Now, he mentions about 5 or 6 other inscriptions dated from this period at the end of the 4th century and the first years of the 5th century, all talking about urban construction renovation efforts in this corner of the forum. Now, I want to be clear, none of these inscriptions can be tied directly to the renovation of the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops, yet they do attest to a broader renovation program of this part of the city during precisely the period in which the Boudroumi and Northwest Shops received a new pavement installation, as well as other security features. So we can situate the renovation of the shops into a prison within a larger rebuilding and construction effort, all of which situate the forum, and particularly the west side, as a still active part of the urban landscape. Yet one datum sketches a still larger picture. Guy Sanders, in his essay, Problems in Interpreting Rural and Urban Settlements in Southern Greece, AD 365 to 700, enters into a debate with T.E. Gregory about whether the late Roman walls in Corinth may have run directly east of the Roman Forum. The inscriptions discussed above suggest that Brown and others are in fact right that the Forum remained an important part of ongoing urban and civic life in Corinth up to at least the mid-6th century. Now, even so, Sanders is right to point out that in the late 6th century to 8th centuries, we see this part of the Forum turned more and more into a burial ground, as graves began to appear throughout the area. Now, as Brown notes, certainly the city center by the late 6th was far less monumental, adorned by fewer remaining old sculptures and almost no new ones, characterized by the skeletons of old buildings hiding under more recent constructions built mainly of spolia. Now, keep in mind, Schronen dates the graffiti from the 4th to 6th century, with a few noted to the 6th century, quote, or later. This calls for more investigation, as it may suggest something quite important for the history of prisons in the longue durée. Now, I'll form this as a statement, though I mean it more as a hypothesis or even a provocation. If the prison was rebuilt from shops into a carceral facility at the end of the 4th century, as seems most likely to me, but continued in use until the late 6th century and perhaps beyond, its prisoners, within its walls, would have gone from sitting in the midst of the living, an urban center, to sitting, being surrounded by the dead. We would then witness here a shift in carceral logic that is of monumental importance. The shift from the prison as situated in what I would call imminent, invisible proximity. You want the prison close, but you want it hidden, right? You see a shift from the prison as imminent, invisible proximity to civic life, to the prison as removed from the land of the living, so to speak, and placed in the land of the dead. Now, as is often the case, this shift was not, I imagine, likely intended at the outset, but rather the consequence of 100 other factors, yet still would have monumental effects for the larger history of incarceration. So why does this all matter? Why should we care about the floor in Corinth? Because it forces us to rethink the way we approach incarceration in the past, to be sure, and perhaps also in the present and maybe even the future. Traditionally, scholars have argued that Roman prisons were temporary, little more than a holding pen before sentencing. But what we see here suggests something different. An institutionalized space of confinement, a place where prisoners spent enough time to inscribe their words, to mark their presence, to leave behind an enduring record of their existence. And that changes things. It means that prisons weren't just incidental places, but they were a part of the civic infrastructure of the Roman city. Or as we argue in our book, they had something like a prison system. Not uniform and legislated and practiced sort of monochromatically in all places, but a system integrated into economic life, social life, religious life. That it's hard to imagine any of those things working without this as a sort of weight-bearing feature. They were designed and maintained, and in the case of Corinth, preserved in a way that forces us to recognize their role in ancient society. Now, as archaeologists, we dig up objects, walls, and structures, but every once in a while, we dig up voices. And when we find them, when we hear them, we have a responsibility to listen. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I don't mean to be rude. I'm just going to leave my phone here to make sure I'm on time. This was great. Given the liberty, but also given introduction for straight to our discussion, I think we're here for you and not to listen to me. So I'll keep my introduction very short, and then I want to make sure that we have more time to learn more about both this case study, more of your work on prisons in general, and a little bit about how that relates to some of the things that we're thinking today. But I do want to frame a little bit the conversation on some of the things that I value and impress me about your work, and they're very close to my own heart and my own research. The first one has to do with function. Function of sites, function of buildings. I think a lot of people who have not dealt with very big and open air excavations don't realize or appreciate that we still have many big monumental buildings that we don't know what they're used for. And again, Corinth and your case study shows that very clearly, and I have the same situation in the Achaia. Buildings that are Roman, late Roman, Byzantine, we have enough of their architectural shell, but we don't know what they're used for. And I think, your works, and for Corinth in particular, shows us very clear that it's worth doing this very long, painstaking work of going back to the legacy data and, kind of marshal all this data to try to figure out what are these buildings used for, and especially when we're talking about public buildings. I think for late antiquity, it's very easy to think about, okay, if it's public, then government or or is living there, or the bishop or whatever. And we forget that there's so many other buildings that have to be present in a city for a city to function. Whether we're talking about its infrastructure or something like its political system. So, this is one of the things that was very close to my heart as I'm struggling with this, to thinking, okay, this is not a house, but it's labeled as a house or public building, but what is it really? The other thing is what you said about voices. And I really don't think we're excavating stones and buildings, but we were never in the business of giving a voice to objects. We were always in the business as our job is to give voice to people, and especially as we move forward, our job is to really give a voice to people that we haven't given a voice, and it has to be part of history until now, whether that means women and children or slaves or people who are in prison. And in fact, as you said, it's very difficult to find them sometimes. So when we do, unless we have strong evidence that you have in the inscriptions, that you can actually see their own words and how they express themselves. The ear for me was incredible to see such a powerful image of something that's sensory. It's not about a voice, but it's listening to them, understanding how they might have dealt with the material and the spaces around them. That was incredible. So, the idea of having the ability and the evidence to give voice and space in the historical narrative for these people. I mean, I study non-elites, and it's always this anxiety and desire to give these people the right place in history. And this is a great case for it. The other has to do with public space. And this is something that, I speak from the point of view of someone who looks at these places a little bit later than you, so in the Byzantine and Ottoman period. And the conversations we have about public spaces are very different than the ones that people do when they study Roman cities. As we are more and more thinking that these public spaces don't exist anymore, which is a mistake. But in your case, and exactly it's the last question that you posed, that these public spaces go through huge transformations, but at the same time there's something very public about it. And this is something I'm going to come back and ask you to talk more about this idea of having prisons in these very visible public spaces, because this is not how modern societies work. We actually put them very far away from public and civic life for specific reasons. And here we see a very different understanding of them being part of the society in a very different way. So that was a little bit my introduction of some of the things that I want us to highlight in our discussion. So the first thing, I want to start a little bit with methodology, as I always do, because
I just want to make sure, you just reminded me, I want to make sure I don't forget.
I will. You can have my wonderful color pink pen. So I want to start a little bit with methodology, because, to be fair, here in Corinth, you both have the evidence, but you also did a wonderful job in lining them up in a very convincing way that this is a prison. I mean, this is as good as it gets. It's like you got a post-it note that said, yes, we were prisoners here. But I know that you know better than me that this is not the case for a lot of these case studies that you're studying. So I want to invite you to tell us a little bit more about what kind of evidence do you see patterns being repeated. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that I trace a little bit of tension in what you're saying between typologies and things that are being repeated, as you saw in Achaia, but at the same time, in Corinth, we have a space that is being transformed. And I say this again, coming from a Byzantine perspective, because we do know that in the Byzantine period, we have a lot of cases, especially for celebrity prisoners, who actually do not go to prison proper, but there are other spaces that they're used for them as a prison, whether that is a monastery, or this is a tower, or a part of the palace. So they don't go where everybody else goes. So spaces that already exist are being transformed to house those prisoners. So I want you to tell us a little bit more about this plan, right? It's actually between this desire of having a typology for them, and how do you balance this with an architectural environment that keeps being transformed?
Thank you. I'll take the methodology question. I mean, the idea for the project really started with like reading this Luc Lavon quote and being like, that feels like it can't be right somehow. How can that be? And then realizing like, well, part of the issue is like, you know, we can identify a Capitolian because we've seen Capitolia and we know what they look like. And then if you see a new one, it's like, well, it checks these like 8, 10 boxes, so that's probably what it is, right? And the lack of a typology was the problem. And so where we started was like, we need to come up with a list of as many as possible, but at least at a minimum, I mean, I didn't have this number in mind, but something like at least half a dozen, where you can say like here, like we know this was a prison. And then begin to look at patterns. And the presentation, they hadn't really thought of it this way till you asked the question, is a good example of like, we kind of distinguish between like, how can we know something's a prison? And then we study the prisons we know and then say like, what are all the patterns? And then like the Julian Basilica, I don't know it's a prison, but I can make an argument it's a prison because it follows this pattern we see elsewhere. The other patterns, like the other clearest example, one of the other clearest examples is from a different prison in Sardinia, the amphitheater prison. Beneath the amphitheater, you have a space that was obviously a cistern, and then it's obviously a defunct cistern because they cut through the hydraulic plaster to create anchors in the walls where you see that chains or some kind of rough object had been run through it, and beneath it you have wooden posts. And then on top of that, you have a graffiti on the wall. So it tells me it's not an animal there, it's a person, and they're being chained and held to the wall. You know, so that's another example. You'd be like, that's about as clear as you can get. And so that kind of stuff, there's some examples where it's like, we found skeletal remains inside shackles affixed to walls. You're like, that's about as clear as you can get. You know, like we've come up with a series of examples. And then you begin to kind of try to look at other things and trying to distinguish between like what we know and secure identifications and interpretations. You know, that's really important for us. About the question of this one being repurposed. It's one of the few civic examples we have that's not underground, right? Which I can't tell you exactly why they didn't pick some defunct cistern, which was the pattern we see at most other places. But what we do see is, I didn't talk about these, but some of my other research team members did, like the prison in Cosa or in Rome. You have an upper prison and then a prison below. And in severals you have like a prison here, they're both below, and then another where we have 2 chambers. But here, what's interesting is you have the 2 chamber thing. So in what was the shop just west of the Boudroumi would have been the entrance and serves as sort of chamber 1. And then you come into the Boudroumi, and what I didn't talk about today is there's 2 levels.
Okay.
Right? So it seems to be that the wooden beams creating a second story were left there, and there's graffiti from that top story as well. So it preserves that sort of like upper, lower level even without being underground. So it has that little window where like it would have been big enough, you could have stuck your arm out, but you couldn't get your body, right? Which is exactly what we see. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm very partial to how these shops and their architecture invites specific transformation in the late antique and later period. You asked me before, I haven't seen a jail, a prison. In the Agora, if I do, you're going to be the first one to call. But it's very interesting to see what some of these shops that survive, what happens to them in late antiquity and Byzantine period. a lot of them are being reused, and it's the architecture themselves and the small spaces and these repeated divisions that invite certain solutions and new functions. So for me, when I was reading your article, immediately just seeing the plan, I was like, yep, that is a perfect space for you. So I think there's something about the pre-existing architecture and its affordances. And I think, you know, in Corinth, that plays out very, very clearly, to me at least, why you have that there, and it doesn't imitate, you know, more underground situations. I want to move a little bit our discussion to my favorite personal thing, which is about people. And I have a lot of questions about this, so I really would love to hear a little bit more from you about what do you think about these people who are being imprisoned there. I mean, I'm a little bit, I think, unsure about who is doing the writing, and we were implying that all these people were able to read and write, or someone is doing this for them, because in terms of speech pattern and language, when I saw a little bit more clearly the inscriptions, there are certain patterns of repetition. So, to me, they're coming from a certain tradition. And then, what do you think about them? I mean, in terms of women, men, who is there, are they guilty for? And my other question is, are they going to stay there for long? I mean, are you imagining that this is the kind of prison that they're going to stay there for as long as they've been sentenced? Or is this a space that they're staying for a while before they're being moved or something else? So tell us a little bit about the people.
Okay, if I miss one, I want to talk about all of them. So on the question of who's in there, we know from other documentary sources, literary sources, even visual sources, that women and children were incarcerated. Around this time, you have, or actually before this time, you have a legislation that says you should separate women, basically create a women's prison that is separate from a men's prison. You don't see that evidence here. You do have one graffito that says, "May fortune prevail for the young women who love the married men." And it's not, that in and of itself doesn't imply that it was made by the female, but to me at least does suggest that there were females in this space. And you have an inscription from elsewhere, from Gerasa in Jordan, around this time that distinguishes very clearly between they had a prison for the condemned and they needed a prison for the people who were still awaiting trial. Right? And the fact that most of these say, "May fortune prevail for," I think there's different ways to interpret it, but the way that makes the most sense to me is they're awaiting trial, and they're actually saying like, "Man, I really hope I get out of here," you know, and they're praying to Fortuna for their release. How long were they in there? Impossible to say. We can just use circumstantial evidence from other things, which maybe a week, maybe months, maybe years. You know, it really depends on how well functioning the system was locally, which is in no way a given that it's going to function well. So they could have been in there for quite some time. What I remember as the remaining question is their literacy.
Yeah.
And this is something that like really, almost every time I talk about this, people point out like, were they all able to write? That's a lot. There's like 25 of these graffiti. Like it seems like a surprising number of people who are able to write. And there does seem to be, you know, I mean, if you think about like literate, non-literate, then a lot of them have to fall on the literate scale. But in reality, you know, if you think about more of a spectrum of like, they're able to write their name, they're able to read basic things. For anyone who's ever learned a second language, you know that like what you can hear, say, read, and write are all very different, you know? And it's not impossible that there was kind of like, hey, would you write this for me? But the obvious fact that we have to deal with is in this carceral space, which didn't seem to have elite figures in it. It gets fragmentary at points, but we know there were Boudroumi, who were probably not highly educated, to say the least. There's another that talks about sons of the barber. So we're talking about people who are not elite and having some access to express himself in written form. It's very interesting, and to me it actually pushes against sort of the way sort of your sort of armchair ancient historian might think about in the past they couldn't read and write like we can today. But, you know, when the prison, they're writing a lot, so.
I think you're right in a little bit separating the idea of writing and reading, or seeing and interacting with something that's written. That's very different, and I think, you know, there is very useful parallel from the Byzantine world and how graffiti, but also inscriptions and services work in that way, where you might not be able to fully write it yourself, so you might ask for somebody else or the help of, but you can read it, or you can read it more easily once you know what it says, right? And then there is also that tactile element that is tracing that with your finger as you're repeating this again and again, because a lot of this is about, it's also prayer. They're talking, they're evoking the Lord and asking for something. So that then becomes, you know, a process of prayer, and that means something else. It's not just about verbal.
I thought this here. This one in particular, because it gets to exactly what you're saying, where like it's poorly spelled, like nothing about this says like transcribe. And here you can actually see like this one is written this way, this one is written, no, this one's written this way, this one's written this way, and this one is probably written this way. So it was actually, you know, to be fully transparent, Agos Kariotis helped me understand exactly what's happening here. But the one that's here seems to just be a really badly drawn, or badly written and misspelled word for ear. You know? So it's kind of like, is that person literate? Well, they know how to misspell the word ear. You know?
But I think that's why you need the drawing over here.
Exactly.
Right? The fact that you have both the word, ear, and here, and the drawing of this. This creates, it evokes a very different situation here of activating, and this is the thing that I see when I see this as someone who's training, thinking about icons as activation. That here you're tapping into this and demanding the Lord to hear while you're tracing your fingers.
Exactly, it's tracing and it's anonymous, so it's almost like a, you know, when I've talked about this before, people are like, you mean people like actually hunch down and it helped them feel better to talk into an ear in the ground? And what I say is like, if you're waiting on an email, how many times do you pull out your phone and check it? And it's sort of like something in your body just wants to be able to have some agency, even though you know you don't. Right? So in the face of feeling like, why won't this person email me? You know, it's like what I can do is I can check my email, and you're constantly doing something with your body that doesn't actually change the world, but it makes you feel like you're doing something. And that, I think, is essentially what this is. And it's very sort of affective to imagine someone like crouching down over this and using it, so to speak.
I think especially, I mean, the reason why I asked you about how long they're staying there was because in one of the inscriptions, the one with the winter, it was the one that made me think that they're, in a way, this is a transient situation. They're staying there until the decision has been made or something like that. And there's something about the way they're talking about their situation that to me shows that this hasn't ended yet. This is not the end game. They're waiting, they're hoping, they demand punishment. And I think there is something worth doing in the future, maybe not you because you're busy, but you know, this is something for your students who might be interested in doing, comparing this with language used in modern prisons, especially in the graffiti, between people who have already been sentenced and people away. Because, I mean, I remember reading about this in modern prisons and the kind of language that's being used. It's very different when you think that, you know, game is over, I'm going to stay here and grow forever. Versus I have hope because this is still in process. And there's something about this, the use of words here that to me kind of signal, you know, just saying them right now, this is a very small environment, but I think it's worth doing. Even as you know, thinking exercise, because that has implications about my next question. It's about the space.
Can I answer this one real quick?
Yes.
So, in case I don't forget. The answer to how long they're going to be there. If they're awaiting trial, we do have evidence of people serving sentences in Antigua. Quite a bit.
Okay.
People set up a judge saying, you've done this, you'll now be sent to this form of incarceration for this limited period of time. Then we have documents saying, you've served your sentence, 5 years, you've been sent here, and now you're released. You know, so you do have that. But if they're awaiting trial, they're there until the governor decides it's time to hear their case. And in this instance, maybe the governor says like, I'm going to go to my winter palace. So sorry guys, it's mid-November, we'll catch you in March. And you're like, and from a sort of affective point of view, not that you want to say one is better than the other, but there's a certain kind of torment that comes from not knowing how long you're going to be there. You know, if it's like you're here for 2 months, that's a kind of torment. You're here for an indefinite period of time, it's a different kind of torment.
Public space. So, I remember, when your article came out, and, I already had seen some of this material before about Corinth, but I couldn't stop thinking the same thing. I was still shocked that it is where it is. This is a very public space. It is also a political space. So I'm always looking and thinking about, the kind of symbolisms and the verbal and non-verbal cues in architecture about what is public and private and how people should be thinking about their role in the city and as citizens. And then you have this prison in a very central location in a very big city. What's that about? What do you think? What do you think the message here is? And not so much about Roman, later on, because Roman public space and later on public space is not the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in this case you have evidence that goes from sort of like Republican up through early and late Roman, where we don't have as many sites from the classical or Hellenistic Greek period that the architecture of incarceration. They tend to be Roman. Now, you don't want to read a lack of evidence as anything other than we have one from Messini, and it's very small and it's just right in the middle of the ground. But Romans seemed to want to let you know that they had a thing that they were confining. It's sort of like if you go into a meeting and you walk in with like a thing that says like confidential, you put it on the table and you just leave it there. We're communicating like I have something. And you can't see it, but I have it and it's power for me. And Romans wanted to communicate that they had that to the world. And they did it through their visual program as well. And it has a lot to do with like Roman authority on top, captive bodies below. And if the theory that I'm putting forward in this talk is right, they actually went from the forum to the forum. And when they shifted, they wanted it to be continuing to be in the forum. And it only becomes outside the forum because of later things that mean, well, the city's now shifting. We're not going to build a new prison, but the city shifts. And now it's in the middle of death. And to your point earlier about where, what I think this research does from a sort of productive modern point of view, it doesn't give us any clues about how to have a more just prison system. That's for sure. But what it does is it holds up to us a kind of mirror as modern societies that says the things that felt obvious and normal and even unavoidable are in fact our own choices. Like the fact that we incarcerate outside of cities is actually unique historically, and that's a choice that modern societies have made, right? And I think that is, I think that's one of the sort of productive outcomes of the research, is to get us to kind of recognize the choices that modern societies have made.
Absolutely, both about justice, but also about the way we think about cities and urban space and public space. But in the case of Corinth, for me, it's striking that there's such physical proximity between the place where decisions are being made and the actual result, which is prison. I mean, it is striking, and we shouldn't take this as given. And And the fact that you are in such a public space, which means that you are teaching your citizens a very important lesson about what you expect from them. This is securing, conditioning, socially, politically for me, what happens when you disobey the law.
Yes.
And it has to be very visible, and it has to be public, and it has to be in your face every day while you're going to do your everyday shopping, so you know that this is, and I'm not saying this as a threatening, but also the expectation. What we expect of you in the standard that we hold you for you to have the privilege of being the citizen of Corinth. So, of course, there's a threat there. Let's not forget what will happen if you disobey. But it is striking. And, you're actually right. For me, it raises more questions about modern choices. Why we decide to move them outside, very far away from urban hubs, both in Greece and the States as well, and how we manage them and how we manage them in relationship with everybody else in society. So just your thought there about this group.
I think that's exactly right. And one of the quotes that comes to mind is there's a line from Livy where he talks about when the prison was built in Rome, the Tullianum. And it sounds like very eerily similar, where he's like, well, this is at a moment in time when a lot of foreigners were coming into Rome and they weren't following the law, so we built a big prison to let them know what happens if they don't follow our laws. You're like, okay, that's not the first time I've heard that kind of rhetoric before, but it tells you what they're thinking, and it's exactly this, like they want to perform it. And perform their domination, their effortless domination of people. And I know every of course, context is different, but at least in the US, I'll often just ask people like, does anyone know where any prisons are in your town? And most people would say, I don't. And that shows you our choice, that we just, people are erased and forgotten, and we move away. One thing that I probably even shouldn't talk about in academic talk, because I don't know how to express this yet, but personally, if you have been inside some of these prisons, I was in COSA, and I just said, I want to do an experiment. And I got down in the prison, and I asked someone else to just go stand in the middle of the forum, maybe 100 meters away. And I said, I want you to talk at a normal voice. And I could hear them underground in the prison, right? And then I spoke at a very full voice, and they could not hear me. And now, that's obviously anecdotal. There's a lot of problems that you could point out and say, like, the structures are missing. But I think I've seen a parallel with other sites where you're like, it's easier to hear what's happening outside, and your voice is silenced to come back out to the world in just the way, like the sonic elements of the architecture. And that's also interesting about how this impacts the society. So.
No, I can see that. I mean, going back to what you said about that inscription in the ear, when we first saw the Achaia, I thought, this is also a response to this idea that we say to someone when someone is in a closed space, no one can hear you. That you take away that voice, and it's not just symbolic. You're literally muting them. No one can hear them. This is a way that you take away the privilege, because again, this is political conditioning. Being a citizen means having space to be heard.
Exactly.
Your voice is not muted, at least in theory.
I want to say one other thing really quickly. On this one, in relation to this, the big building in the middle, that's the Boudroumi. It looks like there's an opening there, but in the renovations, they would wall that off and put a window. But you'll notice that one of the graffiti was found outside, directly outside the Boudroumi. Now, how do we make sense of that? And what I suggest in the article is, John Chrysostom, the bishop around this time period, talks about the prisoners being brought outside the prison. They sit there for hours because they need to ask for money.
Okay.
And then you're also like, why do they need money? And then you've got, this is, centuries later, but you have paintings of exactly that, of here's the prison, here's the wall, and here's a prisoner sitting right outside. So they're sort of behind the wall, but sometimes brought it in front of the wall, making them more visible to society.
Yeah, that's interesting. The other thing I was thinking about, and again, just the final point about this idea of visibility and display, has to do, where between a situation like this, where you're mostly hiding this kind of prisoners, but then you parade other types of prisoners who are going to, these are captives of war or political prisoners who the treatment of their body and their personas is very different. Before they might end in a place like this, but I think that that's a little bit of an interest comparison there of depending on what prisoner tribe you belong to. These questions of visibility, display, or hiding will play out. So I wanted to hear you kind of comment about this.
I, in fact, do have a comment. If I can get there, it should be right.
Did I not put the mosaic of captives in here?
No.
Okay, I didn't put the mosaic of captives in here. But the mosaic of captives is interesting because it's this tribunal, and the floor where you're hearing civic trial is decorated with Berber prisoners of war. So Romans do want to parade prisoners of war, but then they're also interested in intentionally blurring those lines. Like they're different legal categories, but from a visual program point of view, they're not only okay with, but seemingly intentionally saying, oh yeah, these are prisoners of war, and this is where we hear civic trials about crimes. And I stand on top of them, and they look like the local population, and I probably don't.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah.
But very good. I want one final, and then I'm going to open the floor. A personal, again, I want to ask you for a final comment as someone who had to go and deal with legacy data. So going through these excavations, I know the notebooks are 1901. So tell us a little bit about this, and especially in this idea of using data from doing excavation in the notebooks and all the excavation, is it well laid, the challenges, the possibility. How was your experience in doing this? This is exactly what I do every day in the Aurora. So I want to hear it from somebody else how this experience is.
When I started working on this because I saw Erkki Schronin's publications of some of these, which he called carceraria, so like prison-related content. And he just says, they're found somewhere near the Northwest Shops. And I'm on the lookout for, like, can we prove there's a prison anywhere? And I'm like, well, if I can prove that these were part of the floor when they were made, then we've got a prison. And I went to Julia Sanu and Christopher Papp, and I said, I'm going to work on this question. Would you give me permission to work on this? Like, yeah, of course, but like, they're 1901. Like, there's no way these notebooks are going to be helpful at all. And what I found with them was it is a lot of work. And I won't say it's always, I don't know if it'll always be worth it, but in this case, I was shocked to find they didn't follow the same archaeological methods that we would in excavation today. That's true. But they did document things as well as they knew how at the time. They were serious people trying to do the best they could. And they, in fact, gave me exactly the information that I needed. And it was kind of shocking that, like, you can kind of reconstruct an assemblage. I could find 8 different small finds that were found right underneath the pavement, and things that were found just right above the pavement. And then it was very productive, and I would definitely recommend it as something that shouldn't be written off too early just because it was made in 1901.